within the discussion of psak on hashkafa.
Yeah.
So, on the face of things, I've heard your speeches, I've heard your lectures on it, and my questions, I suppose, are twofold. First of all, what's the approach to say there's no psak? There's no psak when it comes to hashkafa, because it seems very intuitive to think that when you can't have an opinion on the reality of God. You can't have an opinion that God does have a form or God doesn't have a form. Things like that seem to be that they would have to come to a consensus. Meaning, an individual person doesn't have the intuitive right to make a claim to what he thinks God's nature is. So I suppose the thing would be discussed, and then a consensus would be arrived at. What's the object? I don't make myself clear.
Now things are really getting muddy. First of all, let's start at the beginning. And could one have an opinion on what God wants from you? How would you know what God wants from you? How would you know what His desires are, preferences are? How would you know what His plans are? Surely we're not competent to figure out for ourselves, what God wants from us and from the world and so forth and so on.
Of course we are.
How can we do that? How do we do that?
He told us.
Well, He told us about Himself also.
Exactly.
So then what's the difference? Intuitively, there's no difference in the starting point whatsoever. Everything we want to say about God is something that He told us about Himself, of course. Without His telling us, we are totally incompetent to say anything at all. He told us rules that He wants us to follow. He told us values that we should pursue. And He also told us about His own characteristics and how He runs the world.
So when it comes to a psak and hashkafa, is it equivalent to when it comes to a psak and halacha?
I think so. I can tell you where the mistake started, but there's absolutely no difference. You want to know what is the truth. What is the truth? And the only way you know the truth is the Kodesh Baruch Hu told us, and He gave us a vast body of information. Somebody has to sift through that information and decide what the truth is. And when there's a difference of opinion, then you vote on it.
But down to today, not the Bez Magadol and then it was cut, or when there was shown in.
Well, we have differences in psak today, just as we have differences in hashkafa today. I mean, without a Sanhedrin, so then you can't have a binding. There's no particular institution of 71 people who can make a decision and vote and then bind the whole of Klal Yisrael. That's true in halacha also. There's still no difference systematically between halacha and hashkafa.
So one would go to their Rav.
Go to your Rav, and the Rav will know what Gedolim in the world who deal with hashkafa issues hold. And sometimes you'll have regional consensus, which you had in halacha also. The people in a certain region will be bound by the regional consensus if it's not a worldwide consensus. The correct position, Iseman has a chapter on this in his book, and I have nothing to say beyond what he said. I can report what he said, but it's all written out, all the sources are there, so you can look at it. The problem started when Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan in the 70s gave a speech and wrote it up, where he found 3 places where the Rambam refuses to give up psak. Now, those 3 places are written in Arabic, so we are subject to the translations. And the translations vary. In one case he says, one does not paskin, or it's not appropriate to paskin, or in one place he says, I will not paskin, and then there are a couple of other places which Rabbi Kaplan missed. They're in the Parish Mishnayos, they're in the Sefer Mitzvos, which, as I say, were written in Arabic. Unfortunately for this thesis, 3 out of the 5 he does paskin in the Mishnah Torah. The very ones he says there isn't a psak, he gives a psak. Now, at this point, there are 3 possible ways out. One is that even though he wrote down in the Mishnah Torah the disposition of this issue, maybe it wasn't a psak. Well, it could be what it might be, but then Rabbi Eisen has a quote from that introduction to the Mishnah Torah where he says the function of this sefer is to tell you what the psak is. Okay. The second possibility is they changed his mind. Okay, if he changed his mind, obviously we go with the later opinion. The later opinion is Mishnah Torah, and he did paskin. But then in the Maramah Tchias HaMeisa, which he wrote at the end of his life, even after the Moreh Nevuchim, he cites this policy that he had going all the way back to the Parish Mishnayos. So then it doesn't sound like he changed his mind. The one possibility is one of the places, the translation, what he says is, I will not paskin. Parish Mishnayos, the commentary of the Mishnah was written for people whose Jewish background was very, very limited. That's why he wrote it in Arabic, because if he wrote it in Hebrew, they wouldn't be able to read it. And his systematic introductions to whole areas of Jewish law, presuming that the reader doesn't know what they are, doesn't know what the basic terminology is, doesn't know what their function is, or content is. Now, in all of the cases where, in those 5 initial places where he doesn't give a psak, they are all cases of where it's a question of how God deals with the world. How does God punish certain types of crimes, and how does he deal with the world? In every one of the cases, he says where the item does not come to a matter of practice. I mean, again, it's Arabic, so who knows exactly what the words mean. He says every time it's a matter that doesn't come to a matter of practice. So, but they all deal with how God deals with the world. Who gets to share in the world to come? And what penalty does a non-Kohen get if he eats truma? And what are the musaf offerings on the various times? What particular types of crimes do they atone for? I mean, it has nothing to do with what you and I do, and nothing to do with foundations of belief, nothing to do with foundations of philosophy. They have only to do with how God deals with the world. So to build out of those examples a general rule that in all matters of Jewish thought there is no deciding opinion is just beyond belief. There's no basis for such a general conclusion at all. Furthermore, the Rambam himself, in the guide, rules on matters that are clearly matters of hashkafa. For example, you certainly know there is an idea that our phase of history will last only 6,000 years. The Rambam rejects that. He says it's wrong. He doesn't say everybody has a right to an opinion, and I just woke up one day and over coffee I decided this is what I'm going to believe. He says it's wrong, and he says why. He says I'm not bound by what the Talmud says because it's a das yochid. It's the opinion of a single individual. Now that's the language of halacha. If it's a single individual, meaning if it had been consensus, I would have had to accept it. And the Rashba says you do have to accept it. You have to accept it. Because Ravina and Rav Ashi put it in, they meant that it's halacha. So they're dealing with this the way you would deal with treifus, or the way you would deal with Shabbos, or with any other area. Rambam says that God's justice is absolute. There's no one who suffers who has not committed a crime, and even though that opinion, according to some Rishonim, is rejected in the Gemara in Shabbos, and there's a Gemara in Brachos talking about Yisurim Shel Ahava, suffering that's brought about by God's love to increase your reward in the world to come. He says, I don't accept that because I have many verses against it and many statements of Chazal against it in other places. And here it is stated as the opinion of a particular scholar, and therefore I reject it. Nowhere is the language, anybody can think what he wants. This is what I think. The language is always, if it's in the Gemara, it has to be dealt with according to the rules by which decisions are made on matters of anything that has to be regulated. There's a famous case in the Gemara, which everybody knows, where the Sanhedrin by Silba Shammai debated whether or not man's creation was successful, it's appropriate, ideal, something. Noach lo adam shel nivra, lo noach lo shel nivra. And the Gemara says they discussed it for 2.5 years, and then they voted that Beis Shammai is right, Beis Hillel is wrong. It's a failure, so to speak, whatever that means. So it's a long term, so pshat what that means. But nowhere do you see any difference whatsoever in these matters. The 13 Nikari Amuna, called the principles of faith, the Rambam writes the Perish Mishnayos, a Jew who doesn't believe all of them is not a Jew. He's not a Jew. Don't save his life if he's in danger. You don't give him charity. You don't treat him with any of the benefits of a Jew. So that's not a psak. You have to believe those things, and if you don't believe those things, then these are the consequences. Is Judaism really, as one student told me the other day, this is something which Reform made popular, I know because I was brought up Reform, that Judaism is a religion of actions, not a religion of beliefs. There are no dogmas in Judaism. That's how Reformed Judaism sought to differentiate itself from Christianity, in particular Catholic Christianity, but it just has no basis whatsoever. No basis whatsoever. Judaism requires beliefs about monotheism, for example. A person who believes there are many gods is out. The idea that philosophical ideas and beliefs are different from anything else. You need to know how to live. Part of living is thinking. Part of living is believing. The Torah has rules for believing, just like the Torah has rules for acting. And thinking and believing become very, very important in the sum total of a Jew's life. The Ramban writes in the end of his introduction to his commentary of the book of Job, an atheist has no mitzvos. Atheist has no mitzvos. Just anything he does doesn't count. He also writes in his Parental Chumash that a person who doesn't believe in a creator has no Torah. He has no Torah, period. Whatever he does is just worthless. So the idea that belief in philosophical ideas is something which, this was started by that speech and an article that was written, but it has absolutely no connection to reality. It's a sad chapter. Yeah, okay. On to the next. This is Q&A in case you're wondering what's going on here.
What was the question? Forgot the answer.
Yeah, the question was, is there such a thing as a definitive ruling in matters of belief, loosely called Jewish philosophy? What's called in Hebrew Ashkafa. And someone made a cause célèbre out of claiming there was no such thing as a definitive ruling, and it's just a mistake. There are definitive rulings, and there aren't everything else. Okay, number 2 on the list.
The next two are more, well, if there's nothing in it, it's more of a proposal type question, if you agree with a certain proposal.
Yeah.
From my experience, when dealing with, discussing it with people ideas of hashkafa or science, and a person will pick a random, disrespectful, a obscure rishon to support a certain opinion that fits in today's science, I'll say that's not really an appropriate thing to do, to pick a das yochid from amongst that's not necessarily accepted. And generally speaking, I get a lot of resistance from that from people because science has a very big impact on people's lives. So I had a question. I don't actually like it. When you give examples of, I've heard you give examples of das yochids, you generally speaking use Hillel Hasheni. And he didn't believe in the coming Mashiach, and he was, nowadays that's kfir. So I thought of a parallel in philosophy, and I may be out, so I'm stating this tentatively. Suppose I was a big Talmud of Dan Denner.
Of who?
Dan Denner. Yeah.
Okay, I will restrain myself from laughing for the rest of the hour.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I know.
Yeah.
I chose him specifically.
Okay.
Actually, I'm not sure. Well, either way, he's a materialist.
Yeah.
He's a determinist to a certain extent. Let's say I believe that is the way of the world today. Because of cognitive science, I'm completely convinced of it. There's an opinion amongst the Rishonim, Chazdei Kreskas, who I recently found out held a similar view. He's a dissenting opinion, people don't hold of him, and I found out it through Sefer Korah. So, either way. Would that be an equivalent? Saying, well, actually, I see it within our sources. I mean, at least it's part of our tradition to a certain extent.
I think there are 2 fundamental issues here, and the one that you have not mentioned, and I think it's the one which needs to be examined with great care, and that is, let's suppose you have 2 different opinions among our sources, genuine authoritative sources, and science agrees with one of them, contemporary science, the science until tomorrow morning, agrees with one of them, right? So, are we allowed to use the scientific position to decide which one of them is right? Do you find anywhere in the history of our tradition where you had this sort of situation where there were different Rishonim and then science came down on the side of one and then said, okay, so science has showed that this Rishon is right, that Rishon is wrong? I don't know of any such case. Only when the Rishon stated that because the reality is this way, I hold this. And when the Gemara said it that way, often they were not telling you the whole reason, and they were not telling you the reason that's operative. But if he didn't say that, and you have a scientific finding, we don't use scientific findings. So now, what are you going to accomplish? You have the two Jewish sources. One says A, the other says B. Science says A. You say, oh, well, we have a Rishon that says A. But you're going to have to show why the Rishon that says B is also justified. He's also justified. So you can't escape the conflict with science by saying we have a Rishon which agrees with science, because the other Rishon who disagrees is also going to have to be justified. So you're not going to accomplish much. Now, you can, in education, I don't know if I dare say this because I'm being recorded, but it is true. In education, you must always, in all Torah education, you must always tell the truth. You must always tell the truth. But you don't always have to tell all of the truth. As somebody who's coming in from the outside, someone who's disposed to be very intolerant of Jewish sources and very intolerant of Jewish ideas. And he says, I heard ABC. It's appropriate to respond, I believe, this is what I've been taught. Look, the Rambam says what you want to be said. The Rambam actually agrees with you, right? Now, that's not the end of the issue. There are other sources as well, and maybe someday when we have 6 or 7 hours to learn together without interruption, we'll be able to go through all of them and try to, but just, you should know that your idea isn't outside the tradition entirely, because the Rambam agrees with you, right? Okay. So I don't think that's unfair. You told him you haven't told him everything. You told him there's more to be studied, and you've told him one, which is a genuine truth. The Rambam holds that way, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But you have to know from the point of view of settling the issue that it will not help to do that. Now, I should say that. Well, it depends about when you're talking about the issue of where an authority has stated something about the physical world.
I also know that I appreciate that, and I hadn't actually thought of that from a point of view of deciding the issue. I meant it more as a counter to people, meaning a better example, so to speak, than Hillel Hasheni.
Oh, I see.
Because the beauty about this is, people want to be able to say science is true. There's an intuition to want to do that. People don't want to go to determinism. People don't want to do that.
I see.
That's why I find this example better. Because people don't want to go there. And people don't know philosophy. So when people hear that, they go, well, that's not legitimate. Of course it's free will. You're like, well, be consistent with that.
But then the other thing is that time passes by certain opinions. Certain opinions get outvoted by time. Don't think of Hillel Hasheni, because they're probably the Sanhedrin voted him down. He lived, if I'm not mistaken, at a time when the Sanhedrin was still functioning. But think about someone today who will burn the Zohar. I'm sorry, let's burn the Moreh Nevuchim. The rabbis of Paris burned the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide of the Perplexed, in public. They were great people. They had a position that it was heresy, and that was voted down over time. The Unban worked very hard to convince the scholarly Jewish world that the Guide of the Perplexed is not heresy. You don't have to agree with it. You can disagree with it like people disagree with anything. But it's not heresy. Someone today who burned the Guide of the Perplexed on the grounds that the rabbis of Paris did 900 years ago will be a heretic, and he himself will be punished for it. There happens to be a certain holdout group from Yemen who rejected, and Diane Fisher was asked by my son whether he could use one of their synagogues to study in during the day when nobody was there, and Diane Fisher said it's usher to have any benefit from them, to have any contact with them. So I'm not using the name because I don't want the name to be mentioned, and they should just have to, because the fact that they reject the Zohar, they reject the Zohar.
I was good. That's what I was going to say.
They reject the Zohar. So the same thing's true with rejecting the Zohar. There were some decades when it was controversial. That controversy has been settled. But someone who will appeal to one of those who rejected the Zohar 700 years ago is making a mistake. He can't do that. Certain opinions become voted out by the consensus of Klal Yisrael. So as I summarize it this way: you could write a book, and the book could be full of footnotes, and the footnotes to every one of them is a footnote to a genuine, valid source, and the book could be completely wrong, completely false, because that particular opinion of that valid source was abandoned over time. Rabbi Iseman told me, I don't know, was the Brisker Rav, or someone in the Brisk school brought a very striking example from last week's Parsha. Miriam and Aaron criticized Moshe Rabbeinu for separating from his wife on the grounds that prophecy doesn't require that. We're also prophets. We didn't separate from our spouses. So why did he do that? What does the Kodesh Baruch Hu tell them? Tells them, you dare to compare yourselves to Moshe? Moses' prophecy is utterly unique, utterly beyond anything else that any other prophet does have, had, or will ever have, including the Messiah. How did you dare compare yourself? Now, if you look at the 13 principles of the Rambam, one is that Moses' prophecy is superior to the prophecy of every other prophet. And Aaron and Miriam failed that. They failed that. They believed the wrong thing. Does that mean that they were heretics? No, it wasn't settled yet. Kodesh Baruch Hu hadn't revealed it yet. But once he revealed it, it's out. Someone will say, but Aaron and Miriam, who's greater than Aaron and Miriam? I'm siding with Aaron and Miriam. Sorry. You know, Kodesh Baruch Hu rejected their opinion. So the fact that a great person said it doesn't mean that today it's available. And just as it is in Psak, now we're coming full circle, where if the consensus of today's authorities say you can't rely on XYZ, so it is in Hashkafa. Something maybe Hirsch said it, or maybe Avraham and Rambam didn't say it, but maybe you thought he said it. But if the contemporary authorities, the contemporary Gottlieb say that opinion is no longer available for us, then it's not available for us. Period. And the fact that 10 years from now they might change their minds, the Sanhedrin change its mind also. The Hurrius talks about that. So it changes its mind. In the meantime, the Gedolim are the leaders of our opinions in all areas, and we follow them, period. I used to have two positions on the age of the universe, and then when the Gedolim came out against one of them, I just abandoned it, that's all. It's not up to me to, my job is to give an intelligent as I can exposition of the positions that the Torah requires, and they are the ones that determine the positions that the Torah requires. Yeah.
Is it usher to daven in a synagogue where the rabbi believes that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was Mashiach? 5 houses down from my house in Miami.
I first of all, I'm not trained in Psak Halacha, so I can't answer you in detail. But it's a little tricky. Now you put it one way. I'm sure you're aware that there are various different ways to put this question. You use the past tense. You use the past tense that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the Messiah. That's what you said, right? Now, if that's what you're asking, I can't imagine why it would be forbidden. We have a tradition that in every generation there's someone who could be Messiah. Rabbi Kiva, when he pledged allegiance to Bar Kochva, didn't make a mistake. He didn't make a mistake. The Rambam is very clear about this. There is such a thing as having what he calls Cheskas Mashiach. Cheskas Mashiach means he's a person who's qualified, he has the personal qualifications, and he has the abilities, and if he will complete certain historical tasks, then we will know in the end that he's Mashiach. If he has Cheskas Mashiach, if he has the qualities, you're required to follow him. You're required to support him, as Rabbi Kiva supported Bar Kochva. In the end, Bar Kochva didn't have the accomplishments, and in that way, we know that he wasn't Mashiach. So now, if someone wants to say in the previous generation was, and that was the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I don't see anything wrong with that. Someone was, and he was certainly a great leader. And in various other groups, it was common to think that your leader, your Rebbe, is the one who could be Mashiach. Does anybody know that it's wrong? Nobody knows that it's wrong. I don't know anywhere that anybody would regard that as a crucial failure. So, if that's the way he felt about his Rebbe, join the club with other groups that felt that their leaders were the ones who could have been the Mashiach. That's not the same as saying he's still alive. It's not the same as saying he's God. And there are people who say both of those things. I'm not exaggerating. I wish I were. So that's why I say, the way you put it, I can't imagine that there's a problem in that. There's a family, a prominent Lubavitcher family. 2 or 3 of them are professors of philosophy. And one of them wrote an article for Jewish Action.
Jacobson?
No. Anyway, he wrote an article for Jewish Action sometime after Lubavitcher Rebbe was nifter, and he outlined the various things that Lubavitchers say, and he was very straightforward about it. There's those who say they're God, or Apikorsim, and they're to be just thrown out altogether, and those who say he's still alive are crazy, but don't throw out all crazy people, have crazy beliefs. And those who say it's Mashiach, he said, many people thought that their Rebbe was a Mashiach, and they based it on a Gemara in Sanhedrin with a Rashi, which they misread. Okay, so they're guilty of misreading a Rashi in Sanhedrin. That's their fault. That's their crime. They're misunderstanding a Rashi in Sanhedrin. Okay. You don't throw people out of Yiddishkeit because they misunderstood a Rashi in Sanhedrin. Right? So I think that that particular thing, that's all it is. I can't find that a very serious problem. Yeah.
Talking about halacha, why is halacha so convoluted and obscure? And even if that can be explained as the path to halacha has to be a process, but even something like shurim, almost all shurim. I mean, I can think of any shurim which isn't a matter of argument. Why couldn't it just be a measure? I mean, we have SI units, which quite easily defined. Why does it have to be such an argument about everything?
Let me give you a historical perspective on this, which I think is useful. I'm going to back up to a parallel, which I think is also useful, and I don't think either of them is appropriately registered. This was brought home to me by one of my former Talmidim who made this remark to me, and I realized that I was not aware enough of it and take it. Why is there a world? Why did God create a world with death and sickness and injury and accident and pain and paralysis and broken limbs? Why did God create a world like that? Short answer is He didn't. He didn't. He created Gan Eden, created the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden, there was no death, no injury, no disease, no broken bones, not even a requirement to work in order to provide for yourself. That's the world that God created. And He gave them a challenge. They failed the challenge. The result of failing the challenge was a gigantic demotion, degradation of the world to the conditions under which we live. You could ask, hypothetical, why did God set it up so that if we fail, we fall this far? Okay, that's an interesting question. But until you know the nature of the failure and the resources that they had and the impact that the failure had on the resources and so on, the question is not a very pressing one. It's not in the form of an objection that it should have been better. It's just there's so much lack of information. I don't know why God did it that way. Now the truth is we are in a similar situation. Tzaddik says, the Ramchal talks about this, I think, in the Adiv Amarom. The way HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah, what we call the Oral Torah, was visible in the written Torah. You could just read it right off. Chazal say, were it not for the golden calf, God would have only given the 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua, and that's all. But what we call the oral tradition is Rav Chochma, the Sakein Rav Kas, a great measure of wisdom to repair great anger. Had there not been the golden calf, it would have been open, obvious, apparent. The Zohar says that when you have a question that you can't answer, that's a blockage. It's a blockage of the flow of divine energy, and that's bad. Shouldn't be that way. Shouldn't be that way. So the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, and all of its process, Milchamta Shel Torah, the war of Torah, and so on, and all the struggles, which a lot is written about, they are written from the point of view of failure. It's not the glory of the Torah, it's how we're dealing with failure. Just like we have Taryag Mitzvos and the Yetzer Hara, we're born as children with only Yetzer Hara, all of that is a result of the failure of Gan Eden. It's failure. So one shouldn't idealize it. Now, if it's Rav Chochma, the Sakein Rav Kas, so we have to see it as a crutch, which if you ever, I'm not wishing this on you, if you break a bone, you'll be thankful for crutches, but you'll pray for the day when you can put them aside. I know, because I had a broken leg and I was on crutches for a couple of months. It was wonderful. I could get around, but boy, was I looking for the day when I could walk on my own 2 feet. The idea that it is so obscure is a matter of blockage, a blockage of a divine flow, and that blockage is because of the failures that we commit. Maharal says, quotes the famous statement, which A certain paraphrase is in the Zohar, but the exact phrase that we use is really a Ramchal. God, the Torah, and the Jewish people are one. And he says that means they're bound up together. And their circumstances affect one another. And when the Jewish people are disunified, so the Torah is disunified. It's disunified because the people are disunified. And somebody says, why can't the Gottlieb, the great sages, agree with one another? Because we don't agree with one another. We, the people on the street, are fighting each other for no reason whatsoever. We put each other down, and we criticize each other. We can't get along with one another. And that causes disunity among the sages. The Torah, it comes to us in a disunified, competitive style, which shouldn't be. We'd be better off if it weren't. You probably all know those of you who are Talmidim, you know the statement of Kina Sofrim Tarbe Chochma. But I'll bet no one here knows what the Maharsha says in that statement. Maharsha says Sofrim is not the highest level. Chachamim is the highest level. If you're on level 2, a lower level, then indeed you may need kina, you may need fighting, you may need competition in order to get at the truth. But divrei chachamim benachas nishboim. The words of the chachamim are spoken calmly, peacefully. And several places the Gemara says that the Torah of Eretz Yisrael is superior to the Torah of Bavel, because in Eretz Yisrael, nochim zeh lezeh b'halacha. So if you're in Bavel, then you're stuck. That's what you have to do. But Bavel isn't ideal. Bavel is Golas. Let's add one more thing because this is associated in my mind. There's a Gemara Menachos where they're talking about tzitzis, and the discussion took place in Bavel. They're discussing what the halacha should be, and then one makes a comment, and it shows that everybody else is wrong, and he has the truth. And the other ones are embarrassed. They say, that he got it right, we all got it wrong. So the Rav says, why are you embarrassed? The speaker is Ravina. He's from Eretz Yisrael. So he's from Eretz Yisrael. It's expected that he's going to get it better. Now, I read that Gemara and I thought to myself, hey, wait a minute. Ravina is one of the editors of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. That means one of the editors had his education in Israel and moved down to Bavel. That means the Babylonian Talmud has a dual input. It, of course, has the Babylonian input, but it has an input from Eretz Yisrael as well. That may be, I thought, one of the reasons why the Talmud Bavli is the last word, not only because it's later. It's the last word. I said that to someone who's a Talmud Chacham, and he said to me, one of the Gonim actually says that. Sorry? The Riv says it, okay. But that's the superiority of Eretz Yisrael in halacha, because nochim zeh lezeh b'halacha. So what you're describing, the difficulty and the blockages and the differences of opinion, we have to look at that as a symptom of a failure. Not a glory, but a symptom of a failure. Had it not been for the golden calf, it would not have been that way. It would have just glowed right out of the written. Ramchal says, by the way, there's the Tanakh, the whole of the Hebrew Bible. All the rest of Judaism is a commentary on the Tanakh. Perush, the commentary, right? Sometimes it's very, very difficult to see those other things in the words of the verses. That's right. It's very difficult for us because we live in a clouded atmosphere. By the way, in Babylon, when you want to invite someone to a discussion, what is the invitation? Toshma. Right? In Yerushalmi, it's Tochazi. One is come and hear, the other is come and see. You know why it says come and hear in Babylon? Because B'machshakim Hoshivani Hashem. God put me in a dark place. In a dark place you can only talk. You can't see because it's dark. Place where there's light you can see. The Zohar is Tochami. Come and see. Eretz Yisrael, where there was still light, it's a entirely different approach. And Babel, where it was dark, there's a gigantic difference. Because when you look around, you get an enormous amount of information all in one shot, simultaneously. When you're communicating orally, it's communication over time. That requires memory. It's a different type of experience altogether. At any rate, I'm just saying that what you're asking about is a symptom of our failed condition. It's not what the ideal of Torah was supposed to be. Well, when you talk about a failed condition, which we're responsible for, so then you could talk about it as Rav Chochmah Sakin Rav Kas, but not something that should be considered as an ideal.
When talking about like our nation being punished and the Torah not being the ideal for what it's about to be, what is why does that matter if like everyone's sort of judged from their personal experiences, etc.?
Okay, this is a crucial question. This is a crucial question, not only in general philosophical terms, but people ask it about parental responsibilities. A person is judged only on his own effort. No matter where you start, so if there's a ladder of achievement from 0 to 100, a person who starts at 23 and makes it to 33 went up 10 steps. A person who starts at 77 made it to 87 went up 10 steps. What difference does it matter if you end up at 33 or at 87? If you took 10 steps, you get credit for 10 steps. So why should it matter where you start? And then the question will be, in terms of parenting, why do I extend myself to put my children on as high a platform as I can when it makes no difference in terms of their personal achievement and the way God will rate them and what God will reward them? I, because I came from no background, went through a period of time in which I had to struggle with mincha. Mincha is a very hard mitzvah because it comes in the middle of the afternoon, especially in the winter, and the afternoons are busy. I'm not sitting around doing nothing. I'm doing important things. I have to stop and daven mincha. It's a struggle. It took years. I got used to it. My children don't have that struggle. My husband brought to daven mincha. It comes the end of the afternoon. The world could stop. The world could fall off a cliff. It's mincha time. Daven mincha. Period. Nothing else to talk about. Their struggle is pay attention to every word. It's a different struggle. But what difference does it make? I'll get rewarded for my struggle starting from no mincha. They'll get rewarded for their struggle paying attention to every word. The answer is, it makes no difference to the person who's doing this struggle. It makes a difference to what God wants done in the world. God needs input on all levels of the scale. The higher up you go on the scale, the fewer people there are to make input. So when I train my child to put him at a higher starting point on the scale, I'm doing it because God wants that done. Not because I'm putting my child in a position where he'll get more reward or have more accomplishment, but that's what God wants from us, to promote people to the higher levels of challenge on the, say carefully, it's not more and less difficult, to higher rungs on the ladder for the achievement to be in that area, that locus, because that's what he wants done. That's all. That's all. The difference it makes is only that God wants that work to be done, and the higher up it is, the less people there will be to do it. So our job is to push people up as much as we can, to have us make a contribution to that level, so that level will get addressed appropriately. But no more than that. Yeah.
You read a book by Chaim Zimmerman called Time and Reason.
Yeah, it's a very old book. It was about 40 years ago. I didn't read too much of it. What I read of it, I felt was not entirely correct in scientific terms, and I thought it was pretty obscure. I did not find it clearly written. So I did not explore it in great detail. I obviously tried to discuss important issues, but I come from, in philosophy, what's called the AngloSaxon tradition, as opposed to the continental tradition. That's a great divide in contemporary philosophy. I remember when I was teaching, there was a conference organized in Canada where they had professors from both sides of the divide, a conference to try to talk to one another, communicate with one another, and share with one another. It was a complete flop. Complete flop. They couldn't talk to one another. People on the Anglo-Saxon side want to speak clearly. They want to speak exactly. They like to find reasons that any intelligent person in the end could understand and would be would settle issues. And because of the desire for speaking clearly and precisely and settling issues, there was a great tendency to look at small issues. Because if you look at a gigantic issue, like, what is life or what is meaning and so on and so on, it's just too big and too amorphous to chop down to little sizes. So the people on the continent said, you guys have abandoned philosophy. You've made philosophy trivial. And the Anglo-Saxons said back to the continent, you're doing poetry. You write things, but they don't convince anybody. There aren't any reasons there. You write in flowery language nobody can understand, and either I'm swept away by your rhetoric, in which case I might agree with you, or not, but you haven't written anything that convinces anybody that you have to be right. So that was the divide, and I was brought up on the Anglo-Saxon side of the thing.
He's very much cross-referencing Hume, Kant, and explaining our position and doing a lot of that.
Yeah, but then I studied those guys and I taught those guys, and I was not impressed. So it could be my fault. He was considered to be a genius, and I'm not a genius. So maybe I just missed out on it. But I was not impressed. Yeah.
If Rishonim mentioned something like the existence that we don't, give an example, the Bela Friend talks about werewolves and stuff, right? So do we have to accept that? We have to.
No,
Rishonim
Rishonim can be wrong. No one held that Rishonim were infallible, and even the Gemara, Rabbi Iseman is very careful about this. He was criticized. There's a fellow from South America, I think maybe from Brazil. His name is Luis Borges, Borges.
He might be Argentinian.
Argentinian? Yeah. Okay. Great writer, philosophically very acute and deep, great imagination, and he wrote a story called Reviews of Non-Existent Books, pretending to write a review of a book that doesn't exist, but in that way, laying out the summary of a position and weakness and strength of a position. It was a very clever idea. I told Rabbi Iseman he should respond to the unbelievably fallacious reviews that have been written about his book as, these are reviews of a non-existent book, because they just, either they don't know how to read, they don't read it carefully, or they lie. One of the three. But the critiques are not of his book, they're not of anything that he wrote. And one of the critiques that's mentioned over and over again is Rabbi Iseman says every scientific statement in the Talmud must be true. And he says the opposite of that. He says there are two types of statements in the Talmud. One is what he calls authoritative, by which he means it goes back to prophecy in some way or other. It goes back to prophecy, it's absolute, and it cannot be attacked or rejected. And as he quotes from Shuva the Rashba, if you have what looks to you like bona fide scientific finding that's against what it says in an authoritative statement in the Talmud, then the thing to do is to say, I see it as a contradiction, I don't know the answer, but the Talmud is right. That's what you're supposed to say. Be honest, don't blink it away, don't pretend, don't falsely misinterpret to get out of the contradiction. No, recognize it and acknowledge it honestly as a contradiction and say, the Talmud is right, I don't know why. The Rishonim, we don't even have that commitment. A Rishon can be wrong in anything that he says. That's one of the reasons that the Rishonim disagree with each other, sometimes quite sharply. And they simply say, no, it's not right. So Unban quoting, talking about a Rashi in Chumash, ve'eno nochon klal. That's just definitely wrong. It's not right at all. Okay? So that means we hold no brief that everything that every Rishon says has to be true. Now, however, Iseman points this out. I think he quotes it from Rav Hirsch and others. The Gemara talks about, the Mishnah talks about a thing that's it grows out of the ground, and it's half ground and half mouse or something, right? And talks about the tomb of such a thing. Does the fact that the Mishnah mentions such a thing mean that the Mishnah believes such a thing exists? Not necessarily. There were travelers, Greek travelers, who were trained in science, and they traveled regions of the world, and they brought back observations of what they saw, and they discussed them, and so forth and so on. One of these respected travelers came back and reported such a thing. The Gemara said, okay, if there is such a thing, what's its halachic status? How would you classify it? What would its laws be with respect to Tumah and Tahara and other things? Right? It was just applying the law to a hypothetical. That's all. So that being the case, the fact that the Rishon mentions it, if he says, I saw one, I dissected it, I found its wings, and so on, so that's one thing. But if he says this is the law for such a thing, he can be following the same tradition. There are people who report these things. As far as I know, these people are reliable. The halacha has to offer an opinion on it. So the halacha will offer an opinion on it. We are, I'm including myself now, we are so blinded by the enormous, unearned pride of contemporary information sources and contemporary scientific speculations that we tend to reject out of hand. When I read the Gemara's discussion of a person who has two heads and two-headed animals and pidyon bend and all the rest of it, I didn't know what to say. I don't know what to say. But that was stupid. The Gemara talks about it, so it's real. We now, of course, know. You know what conjoined twins are? Conjoined twins are the one body, two heads coming out from where the shoulders are, a 5-chambered heart, 3 kidneys, and so forth and so on. And the two heads have to learn how to get along. One head controls one side of the body. The other head controls the other side of the body. That means each head controls one leg. Can you imagine learning to walk? And they live. There's a couple of, a female conjoined twin, and Time magazine had pictures of it. I thought to myself, wow, how stupid can you be? You were questioning the Gemara? There it is, pictures in Time magazine. Now I believe it. There are the pictures in Time magazine. Rabbi Yochanan killed the Talmud who said that. Rabbi Yochanan's giving a shir, he's talking about the gems that will be available when the Mashiach comes. It's, how can that be? It's impossible. Then he went on a trip and he saw the gems and he came back and said, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi, you're right. I saw them. And he looked at him and he made him into a pile of bones. I taught it to you as Torah. You didn't accept it. You saw it and you accepted it. You believed your eyes. You're not worthy of being in this world. So the attitude, I think, has to be one of humility. Rabbi Iseman has a number of cases where the Gemara said something and the whole of the scientific world laughed at it until it turned out to be right. There's some people today who criticize Chazal for certain mistakes, and he goes through their arguments in great detail, and he shows that the arguments don't hold water. I would say that, as the Rashba says, if it's a statement that goes back to prophecy, sometimes Chazal didn't do that. Sometimes Chazal used the contemporary scientific information. I don't know if I'm repeating myself to you guys, but Rabbi Iseman points out something fascinating. What is a treifa? Gemara cites Yudches treifos, 18 conditions which an animal is called a treifa, and we paskin that if a treifa can't live for a year. Treifa is also used for human beings. I'm sorry, where do those treifas come from? Halacha Moshe Sinai. Revelation that God gave to Moses at Sinai. What about a person? A person is a treifa. What makes a person a treifa? The Rambam paskins, whatever contemporary medical science says is a fatal condition, is a treifa for a person. The halacha is determined by contemporary medical science. Not the revelation to Moses. There was no revelation to Moses about people, only about animals. So now, you'll have the Chachamim talking, this condition in an animal is a treifa. This condition in a person is a treifa. They're two entirely different statements. The one can't be challenged because it goes back to Moses. The other could be challenged and say, in our times it isn't so, because medical science in our times is something different. So you have to classify each statement separately to see what the basis of Chazal was. The gestation period of a snake is 7 years. So they said the Greeks did an experiment and it gave birth after a year. So Chazal said, did you see that it wasn't disseminated 6 years before that? Did you check that? No? Then how do you know? He learns it from a pasuk. The Tana learns it from a pasuk, and he will not brook any opposition to it. Now, guess what they discovered in the last couple of years? Some snakes, big snakes, are hermaphrodites. It's unbelievable. Some snakes can fertilize themselves. They have male and female organs and can fertilize themselves. And then they can give birth. Is that the gestation period that Chazal were talking about? Maybe they're only talking about it where it wasn't done in hermaphrodite fashion. But science didn't know that till 2 years ago. Hermaphrodites are supposed to be either insects or tiny, tiny creatures. No one thought that snakes, big snakes, could be hermaphrodites. The natural world is full of things that science doesn't know. This pretense. I got a letter from a manal of a religious school in Canada. He said, what am I going to do? A 15-year-old walked into his class and said, science has explained everything, so we don't need God. What? How ignorant can you be? He thinks science has explained everything. So on my blog, I just made a list of, 10 outstanding problems which science hasn't explained, and more have arrived since then. But a kid like that is obviously in trouble. He wants cheeseburgers and other things like that, and so he's going to use something which he thinks his Rebbe can't answer, but it has no relevance. Anyway, I'm drifting a little bit. Next question, yeah.
Well, firstly, it's Rav Hirsch. In his chapter.
Sorry?
It's Rav Hirsch in his chapter on Agatha that brings that example.
Yeah, he was quoting, yeah.
He said, yeah. Also, the answer to a question like that, not sure if you were answering the question, is, okay, let's say we get to a stage where science has explained everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean, even if you're right, it doesn't mean God is irrelevant now. If anything, God will be more relevant. God will be more obvious.
I think there's a problem here. All right, we have a few minutes. There are two different levels of discussion. One is, can science prove that God doesn't exist? It's quite obvious that it cannot. Whatever science finds, whatever science discovers, whatever science can explain, it's always possible to say that that's the way God is running the world. The second question is, what evidence do we have in the world of God's activity? And the more science explains, the less of that we have. That's not zero. That's not zero. For millennia, life, the fact of life, was a sign of God's activity in the world. If you could fully explain life in scientific, materialistic terms, then that whole area of evidence becomes deleted. I don't think that's worthless. Depends upon whom is the burden of proof. If you put the burden of proof on them to show we're wrong, they can't do that. But if they put the burden of proof on us to offer evidence that we're right, anything that they explain in materialistic terms would be a loss for us in terms of evidence. Now, the oldest question in philosophy and the most difficult question in philosophy is, why is there something rather than nothing? And everybody agrees, except for one raving idiot. Everybody agrees that philosophy has never made any progress in that question, and knows a clue how to make progress out of that. A cosmologist named Lawrence Krauss, probably one of ours, Lawrence Krauss wrote a book. Why is there something rather than nothing? Science can explain it. Quantum mechanics can explain it. So on and so on. Well, there's a wonderful fellow named David Albert, who's a professor at Columbia. He got his PhD in physics and then went into philosophy of science. So he knows both sides well. He's published in research physics, and he's published a great deal in philosophy of science. He wrote a scathing review of Krauss's book, a scathing review. And but if indeed there could be a natural, materialistic, scientific explanation of why there is something rather than nothing, of the origin of everything, I think that would hurt. That's why, having noted that the theory of evolution could do nothing to show that God isn't behind the whole of life, I'm at pains to show that the theory of evolution has gigantic weaknesses in scientific and philosophical terms. So that there's absolutely no reason to accept it as true. I think that's a game. And I think those two have to be kept distinct. People take the easy way out by saying, we could always say God did it that way. We could, but that only defends us against being refuted. It doesn't provide us with positive evidence that we're right.